a romantic and ultimately tragic tale of a passionate love affair that crossed and transcended all the cultural, religious, and political boundaries of its time. The book has been nominated by the critic Ms. Anjum Hassan. Ms. Hassan writes poetry, fiction, and criticism in English. Street on the Hill was her debut collection of poems. Her debut novel, Lunatic in My Head, was shortlisted for the Crossword Book Award 2007. Her second novel, Neti Neti, was longlisted for the 2008 Man Asian Literary Prize and shortlisted for the Hindu Best Fiction Award in 2010. Her fourth book, the short fiction collection Difficult Pleasures, was shortlisted for the Hindu Literary Prize and the Crossword Fiction Award. She has also contributed poems, articles, and short stories to various national and international publications. Ms. Anjum is currently books editor for The Caravan. We invite Ms. Hassan to share her views on the book. To introduce the author, Mr. William Dalrymple, a British historian, writer, art historian, and curator, as well as a prominent broadcaster and critic. He is a best-selling author whose books include Zandu, City of Jinns, From the Holy Mountain, White Mughals, The Last Mughal, and most recently, 9 Lives. He has won the Thomas Cook Travel Book Award, the Sunday Times Young British Writer of the Year Award, the French Prix d'Histoire, the Wolfson Prize for History, the Scottish Book for the Year Award, the Duff Cooper Memorial Prize, the Asia House Award for Asian Literature, the Vodafone Crossword Award for Non-Fiction, and has, prior to the shortlisting of Return of a King, been longlisted 3 times for the Samuel Johnson Prize. We request Ms. Anjum Hassan and Mr. William to kindly start their discussion on the book White Mughals. Our next session is a discussion on the book White Mughals, a romantic and untimely tragic tale of a passionate love affair that crossed and transcended all the cultural, religious, and political boundaries of its time. The book has been nominated by the critic Ms. Anjum Hassan. She writes poetry, fiction, and criticism in English. Street on the Hill was her debut collection of poems. Her debut novel, Lunatic in My Head, was shortlisted for the Crossword Book Award 2007. Her second novel, titled Neti Neti, was longlisted for the 2008 Man Asian Literary Prize and shortlisted for the Hindu Best Fiction Award in 2010. Her fourth book, the short fiction collection Difficult Pleasures, was shortlisted for the Hindu Literary Prize and the Crossword Fiction Award. She has also contributed poems, articles, and short stories to various national and international publications. Ms. Anjum is currently books editor for The Caravan. We invite her to share her views on the book.
Being introduced to me twice. William's only been introduced once, but you'll get to hear it all again. In the meanwhile, I will tell you a little bit about White Mughals. The reason why I nominated this book for this festival and why I was drawn to it is probably the reason a lot of readers were drawn to White Mughals. And that is because the subject of the book is the stuff of fantasy, is taboo, is completely unexpected. Namely, love between Indian and British, love between the colonizer and the colonized. The second reason why I chose the book, which is a more personal reason, is because it's set in South India, which is where I live, in Bangalore. And to read a wonderful narrative history from South India, set in an era about which there's very little work done, was an added reason to want to share this book with all of you. And as William says very early in the book, there's actually very little historical curiosity about the Deccan, and especially the Indo-Muslim culture of the Deccan. And as he says, I love this quote, so I'm going to quote it. For every book on the Deccan Sultanates, there are 100 on the Mughals. And for every book on Hyderabad, there is a shelf on Lucknow. So that gives you a sense of how much work there remains to be done on this region. And into this gap, into this lacunae, we have this wonderful narrative history, very engagingly told, about a late 18th century, early 19th century story set in the court of the Nizam of Hyderabad. Now, William, as you know, has been working on Indo-Islamic culture for quite some time, and this one book is part of a larger project of writing about this culture across the country. And he's a historian, he's obviously very interested in politics, but he also brings to the writing of these books a novelist's eye and a huge interest in people, in characters, in what drives human beings and individual psychology. He's also, to my mind, an ethnographer. He's not just interested in what's happening between men in power. He's also interested in what the women are saying, what's going on in the bazaar, what's going on in a religious festival, what people are wearing, what they're eating, and all of these details, the social lives of the upper classes, what happens when a child is born in this very ritualized culture, what are the initiation rites for a child, what kind of gifts did people exchange in the 18th century. All of these things he helps us to imagine. And that's an added pleasure of reading The White Mughals, or reading indeed any of his books that are part of this project. Additionally, there is this larger historical canvas. Like I said, it's set at the end of the 18th, early 19th century, but the larger history of the Indo-Muslims in the Deccan is the background. And that history, as you know, stretches back a few hundred years, starting with the Deccan Sultanates, the winding down of the Deccan Sultanates, then the Mughals took over, and then there was this rise of this sort of sub-Mughal culture in the Deccan. And it was concentrated in the court of the Nizam of Hyderabad. And that is the figure who's sort of at the center of this story. The White Mughals of the title, and William and I are going to talk about why it's in the plural and who are these White Mughals. They are men who hold positions of power in the East India Company. So they're very much in tune with the political and the economic ambitions of the company. These are men who are there to further these ambitions. But they are also amazingly indigenized figures. So these are people who speak fluent Persian, who speak Hindustani, who write in these languages, who can sit of an evening sipping wine, listening to poetry, discussing Hafiz. They wear Indian clothes, they enjoy Indian food, they follow many Indian traditions to do with eating and cooking and hosting guests. They are interested in Indian mores and Indian customs, especially Indian etiquette, which is very important at this point, because we are, after all, talking about a Nizami, courtly culture. And, of course, it goes without saying that they also marry or take on Indian women. And what is interesting at this period is that there are a lot of Englishmen in positions of power in the company who have Indian mistresses. They're called bibis. Some of them also marry Indian women and have children who they call natural children. The term for illegitimate children at this point is natural children. And all of this is interesting culturally. It does alter the character of this encounter between Englishman and Indian, but it isn't of great political import. It's not rocking the boat politically much. The children of these unions are forbidden by the company from joining any company of it, any station within the company. So it doesn't really make a difference to the affairs of the company in India. Now, within this landscape, the affair and the marriage, the story of this book, really causes a scandal and rocks things. And why is that? It's for two reasons, essentially. One, because Khair-un-Nisa, who marries James Kirkpatrick, who is the resident with a capital R at the court of Hyderabad. She is a woman who belongs to a very important family in Hyderabad. The male relatives of her family hold positions of great importance at the court of the Nizam. So there are a lot of people who are very unhappy that she has married an Englishman. Secondly, she belongs to a family of Persian Saids who have emigrated from Persia couple of generations ago, and they're strictly endogamous. They consider themselves descended from the Prophet. They're strictly endogamous. They only marry within themselves. So let alone marrying an Englishman, it would be a scandal to even marry a Sunni. And here this young woman, and she's 14 years old when she sees James Kirkpatrick for the first time. She decides, and there's also a lot about what she wants, which is fascinating. She wants to marry James Kirkpatrick. So it's really trouble. It means big trouble for a lot of people. Thirdly, the reason why it gives William the occasion to tell such a wonderful story is that it endangers the relations between the British and the Hyderabadis. Now, at this point, the company is encroaching in different ways on India. And in the Deccan, the three major forces that they're fighting, or trying to co-opt are the Nizam, of course, but also Tipu Sultan and the Marathas, who are a fantastically powerful force at this point. Now, this is a very delicate relationship between these three on the one side and the British on the other side, and it's in their interests that they maintain good relations with the Nizam. And this marriage and this affair comes very close to wrecking that relationship, and that is why it is of such great import to the history of the Deccan at this period. So that is the story, and William's going to tell you actually the more juicier bits. I'm just giving you the outlines. And it's wonderfully rich with drama, because William also has a fantastic sense of the dynamic of things at this point, and how at so many junctures it was touch and go. Napoleon Bonaparte lands in Egypt, and Tipu has sent message to him that, come and help me fight the British. And he says, yes, I'm coming. And if that had happened, if that had worked out, the history of the Deccan would have been very different. So this is just one example, but there's so many junctures at which things could have turned out very differently. And that's, for me, again, one of the pleasures of this book, that you really realize this was not some timeless, sepia-tinted era. It was an era of intense struggle, intense change, intense drama. The story, like I said, is about hybridity. It's about these group of Englishmen being very enamored of India. And William's larger thesis in the book is that all colonizers who've come to India through the centuries have in some sense they've fallen for India. They've become indigenized, they've become hybrid, they've changed fundamentally. And he has a wonderful quote by another historian who says of the Mughals that they came out to India as ruddy men in boots, and they left 300 years later as pale persons in petticoats. So you see how the Mughals were changed by their encounter with India, and that's true of the Portuguese. He talks about the French. So all of these, and the British at this juncture were poised to also sort of take in their love for India and their feeling for India and see how they could negotiate that with their ambitions for the country. It's not as if they did not have those ambitions, but there was also sympathy and there was also affection. But at the point that this affair took place in this marriage, things were changing. Attitudes were hardening. That kind of more affectionate, even romantic encounter was more and more being looked down upon. And the story of the book, in one sense, is the story of how that happened and why that happened, and importantly, the consequences of this rift. Thank you.
Enough introductions. Anjum, thank you so much for that generous and perceptive and lovely introduction. This book grew out of an earlier book, which I wrote when I was in my early 20s, called City of Jinns. And in that book, there's a figure two figures who fascinated me and who took up more of the book, perhaps, than they should have done or deserved. William Fraser, who was my wife's ancestor, and his boss, Sir David Ochterlony. And these were intriguing figures because they broke the stereotype that we see in every Hindi movie, that exists in every Victorian textbook, of the British in India being apart, separated, khaki boots and pith helmets and clubs and civil lines, separated in every way, mentally, physically, and sexually from India. What was fascinating to me about these two figures who I discovered in my very first Indian book was that they broke every stereotype that I knew of the way the British were meant to have interacted in this country. William Fraser was, like so many of the company servants, 16 when he arrived in India. You weren't allowed to join the company's civil service after your 16th birthday. So the kids who were coming out here were kids who today wouldn't even have done their A-levels, never mind gone to college. They wouldn't be allowed to buy a drink in a bar. But they arrived in Fort William College, and by the age of 19, they were administering great tracts of this country. And it became clear, the more I researched them, that there were, in a sense, two different stories. One was the story of the British who stayed in Calcutta, Bombay, or Madras, and they remained in their own little white bubble, very much fulfilling the stereotype that we know of. But for those who were sent off to remote postings, particularly in these very attractive Indo-Islamic courts like Lucknow, Hyderabad or Delhi, or in the Rajput courts in Jodhpur, Jaisalmer and Udaipur, separated from people of their own race, they naturally, over a period of time, became indigenized. And by the time I began researching this, I realized that William Fraser and David Auchterlonie were not unique figures, but were in fact emblematic of any of the company servants who got sent up country, away from the main population centers. William Fraser was an Oriental scholar. He spoke perfect Persian and Urdu, Bengali and Hindustani. And he collected manuscripts. He commissioned the last great work of Mughal painting, which is called the Fraser Album. It's often classified as company school painting, but the painters who painted it were the Mughal court artists, the circle and family of Ghulam Ali Khan and Mazhar Ali Khan. While they altered their style very slightly for their patrons, it's basically the last great flowering of Mughal painting. He was a friend of Ghalib. He was a pupil of Shah Waliullah's grandson, extremely bright man, but who also integrated himself and his family life into the Mughal court. He had a wife who lived out in Rewari in Haryana, and he had two children by them. There were legends in Delhi that he had this enormous train of concubines, but certainly all the written evidence and pictorial evidence we have points to just one woman. And it seems to be mainly Delhi gossip that gave him this inflated harem. David Auchterlonie, his boss, was similar. Born in Boston, thrown out of America at the American Revolution. He came to India by the age of 19 and never left it again. And there's a wonderful image of him in the India Office Library. And all the official pictures of Auchterlonie in the National Army Museum and the National Portrait Gallery show this old buffer and a company red coat, very much the kind of man you'd expect from the official Victorian histories. But in this miniature in the India Office Library, he's shown at home. And he's wearing a sort of Fab India kurta with a turban. He's got a spittoon, and he's got these dancing girls dancing in front of him. A very apt way of showing a man who famously had no less than 13 Indian wives, each of whom had her own elephant. And every evening they're recorded that this succession of elephants, with Auchterlonie in the lead, followed by 13 wives, would come out, do a loop around the Red Fort, take the air around the Yamuna, and then head back. And there's one in this miniature, my favorite detail is above this Nautch party with the dancing girls, Auchterlonie in his kurta, you have the outraged Scottish ancestors peering down from the family portraits, looking down at the Ur Devi, wondering what's happened to this Scot in the Mughal atmosphere. But if you look, as I did in researching this book, at the company wills, you realize these exotic and to us slightly comical figures were the norm. In a brief period between 1780 and 1800, 1 in 3 company servants was leaving all his goods and his wills either to an Indian woman or an Anglo-Indian child. In other words, a minimum of 1 in 3 households in the company service were ethnically, religiously, and sexually mixed. And these couples had as wide a variety of the sort of relationships that you'd find in any group of couples today. Some were girlfriends, some were live-in girlfriends, some were sort of serial monogamers, some got married and stayed with one woman all their lives. And some were married, some were unmarried, some were very high status, some were sweeper women who were sweeping the barracks, going off with Irish squaddies who themselves had been press-ganged off the streets of Portsmouth or Bournemouth or London. And so up and down the social register, you find a whole variety of different sorts of relationships working out their own solutions to these problems. There's one wonderful picture in the Royal Asiatic Society in London of a painter called George Beechey. He was the godson of George III. His father was a court painter in London. He went out to India to try and make his fortune. And in this picture, he's shown with both his wives. He's in Lucknow. He's wearing a full jama, full Mughal outfit. He has a very beautiful young wife attached to his arm, staring lovingly into his eyes, and an older Begum sitting on an armchair at the back of the picture. And the first thing you see when you look at this is this chap has got two wives. One is young and pretty, one is slightly less so. What you don't notice is that the wives are themselves beginning to be affected by this process, because the elder Begum is sitting on an armchair. You hardly notice it because you're so used to this happening in this country now. But in the 18th century, for an Indian woman to sit on an armchair rather than a musnad or cushions on the floor was itself a statement of crossing cultures. She had adopted Western ways. And you find this in all these portraits, that these couples are working out different ways of eating or living or sleeping together or whatever it was. And each one works out their own solution, their own mixing of cultures in a way that any mixed couple would today. You know, sometimes you have food from one culture, sometimes you have food from another. Are you on the floor or are you on furniture? Are you wearing kurta pajamas or are you wearing Gap clothes? And these things are being worked out for the first time at this period, but it's happening on a massive scale. 1 in 3 couples, 1 in 3 households are legally registered, if you like, in the company records, in the company wills as mixed. But it goes down. It happens at its most intense during a period when there is political equality. Between 1780 and 1800, the company could go either way. Tipu defeats the company on 3 occasions. At the Battle of Polilore in 1764, it's such a massive defeat that 1/4 of the entire company army ends up in captivity at Srirangapatnam. Another victory like that, and the British could have been wiped out in the 1770s. In fact, it went the other way, but it might not have done. And the people living at the time didn't know which way it would go. So when you have political equality, you have social equality. And at this period, there was no question that in many ways, scientifically, the Mughals were ahead of the Europeans. So, for example, the Mughal astronomers knew of one more moon of Saturn than the European ones do, and that the extra moon of Saturn is only discovered by William Herschel, discovered in inverted commas, in the 1880s. So there was no clear scientific edge that the British had over Indo-Islamic culture at this period. No clear military edge. This only develops really by the 1850s. And in that political equality comes the social equality that allows this intermarriage. But the record in the wills shows how that changes. From 1 in 3 households being intermarried in the 1780s, it's down to 1 in 4 by 1800. It's only 1 in 6 by 1810. By 1830, it's 1 in 8. And by 1840, there are virtually no Indian women registered in company records at all. So it shows that in sexual and in social matters, liberalism can go into reverse. We kind of have an idea today that ideas of multiculturalism are an unstoppable liberal force going in one direction, that we have greater intermarriage across ethnic, religious, and national boundaries. But the history of this period shows that it can go into reverse, that you can have an entirely mixed society, which then closes up. When this book was first planned, I thought of writing about 5 or 6 different individuals, so it would be a succession of mini biographies, and it was called The White Mughals, and it was going to be a general picture of a group. But about 2.5 years or 3 years into my research, I realized that one story was running away with it, and this was the story of James Kirkpatrick and Kerenisa. What was special about this story was that it took place in a crucial geopolitical moment. The British needed to ally with Hyderabad in order to defeat the other 2 powers of the Deccan, the Marathas and Tipu. And the alliance with Hyderabad, which was the weakest of the 3 Deccan powers, was of crucial importance to the British. And it was crucial that the ambassador there didn't screw things up. So when the newly arrived British ambassador in 1800 manages to get the niece of the Prime Minister pregnant at the age of 14, this is not just a kind of mild social embarrassment, it's potentially political dynamite. not just a matter that would result in the expulsion of the ambassador, but if it's handled wrongly, could end the entire British Hyderabadi alliance, just at the moment that the British need the Hyderabadis to take out Tipu and then the Marathas. It's a crucial moment. So for that reason, we have details from both sides about this relationship in a way that simply doesn't survive for most of these other interracial relationships. With Fraser, we have a few letters. With Dr. Loney, we've got a picture or two. With a few of the others, there are details that can be put together, but never really more than 10 or 20 pages worth of detailed description. The Kirkpatrick letters, because this was so crucial, were unique in that there existed a weekly correspondence between Kirkpatrick and his brother in Calcutta, which is incredibly intimate and gives the details of every aspect of this affair, from the bedroom through the dining room to the political salon. And where it got really intimate in the sexual details, he goes into code. And luckily one page had the key to the code written above the translation, if you like, written above the letters. So having got that, I could read the dirty bits, which give, of course, helps when you're trying to sell movie rights, but also brings a measure, satisfies one's curiosity on a whole variety of levels. And also there is a whole series of British inquiries commissioned by Calcutta, and there is an apologia written by Kerenice's own uncle about this desecration of the family honor. So we know what happened from her point of view. Plus, miraculously, there are pictures and some writings from her family, and various marriage documents and things, all surviving with the descendants. So quite suddenly, this grey area of interracial relations, which is fleetingly referred to in the wills, we have the macro picture with statistics from the company wills. Suddenly you have one story illuminated in fantastic detail. And I ended up following this up with, and the book is really about this one love affair. Kirkpatrick meets this girl. She comes to his residency and gets pregnant there when she is engaged to another man. This happens, it's clear, with the collusion of her mother and grandmother, who don't want her to marry this other man. What was wrong with the potential suitor is never spelled out, whether he was a drunk, crazy, a wife-beater. There was clearly some reason that united the women of the family to risk everything to get her to go with Kirkpatrick rather than this cousin that she was being married off to. And the women, it nearly goes wrong. There's nearly an honor killing. The grandfather takes his sword out, holds it above her head, and then can't do it. He can't kill his granddaughter. And he threatens to go off and become a fakir instead, having lost his honor. But these two get it together. Kirkpatrick successfully pulls off a major treaty, partly because of his relationship with the family. He turns what's a potential massive diplomatic gaffe into a major diplomatic opportunity. And the result of this affair, and the union which Kirkpatrick manages to negotiate, is the survival of the Hyderabadi state as the largest territorial independent power in India up until 1948, 1 year after partition. And that huge area that led to the Nizam being by far the largest landholder in India, the only one of the princes to be His Exalted Highness rather than just His Highness, and to have more gun salutes and everything else than all the other princes, is the direct result of this treaty and this love affair. So it's not just a matter of sort of prurient interest about one couple. This affair has a major political fallout. The story itself, though, goes wrong. Having successfully negotiated the treaty, having built a wonderful house modeled with the same plan as the White House in Washington, which is still there, it's the Koti Osmania Women's College building, which is just about to be restored this week. It has a second mahal behind it in the garden, hidden away, the Rang Mahal, which is the Mughal place where Kirkpatrick goes at night. So by day, he's wearing a company red coat in a white Palladian villa. By night, he's in a Rang Mahal reciting poetry and Hafiz among the wall paintings and fountains of Kerenice's night garden, full of scented flowers that you can smell your way around in the moonlight. It's unbelievably romantic and wonderful, but it goes wrong. The atmosphere is curdling. The racism and the superiority complex of the British is growing after their defeat of Tipu and the Marathas. And seeing this, Kirkpatrick decides he must send his kids back to England to be educated. Karenisa doesn't like this, but he insists on it. And their children are sent off to Madras, first to have their portrait painted by a young painter who went on to be very famous, Chinnery. And one of the most famous of Chinnery's pictures is the two Kirkpatrick children. They're then put on a boat and sent off to England. Kirkpatrick catches malaria and dies on the way to Calcutta, having seen his kids off. His wife is then seduced by his deputy. The deputy does not marry her, takes her as a mistress, and then drops her off in a town on the coast called Machilipatnam, where she falls into depression and dies. The kids arrive in England, are converted to Christianity within they're baptized almost on arrival, are not allowed to communicate with their mother. And they grow up. Sahib Alam and Sahib Begum are rechristened William George Kirkpatrick and Catherine Aurora Kirkpatrick. They grow up in a villa in Torquay. Catherine, Kitty, as she's known, becomes an evangelical Christian. Her tutor is a young scholar who turns out to be the future Thomas Carlyle. And he writes a novel about her called Sartor Resartus. What's so wonderful about this story is at every stage these kind of weird coincidences turn up. Then, married to a Hussar officer, aged 30, having apparently forgotten all the world she came from, Kitty goes to stay with some friends, and they take her to another local grandee's house for tea one afternoon, a house called Swallowfield Park. Kitty walks in the door, swoons and faints. And the reason she faints is that up on the wall is the Chinnery picture of herself painted just before she left Calcutta. So when she comes to, she begins to investigate what happens. And it turns out that this picture has been snaffled by the owner of the house, Henry Russell, who was the man who seduced Karenisa after Kirkpatrick's death. And he is there. He confesses some of this to her. In a veiled way. But she continues her investigations and discovers that the granny, who originally facilitated the seduction of Karenisa by Kirkpatrick, is still alive in a harem in Hyderabad. They haven't been in touch for 30 years. And I'm just going to, so having discovered she's alive, she of course writes to her. And before we return to discuss all this, I'll just finish by doing a brief reading, not of any of my own writing, but the letter that Kitty Kirkpatrick writes to the grandmother she hasn't seen for 30 years. She's writing, an evangelical Christian, newly married to a Hussar general in a villa in Torquay. And she's writing to her grandmother, who is a Hyderabadi Shia Muslim living in a harem in Hyderabad. Two women separated by 2,000 miles and 30 years. My dear grandmother, I often think of you and remember you and my dear mother. I often dream that I am with you in India, and that I see you both in the room you used to sit in. No day of my life has ever passed without my thinking of my dear mother. I can remember the veranda and the place where the tailors worked, and a place on the housetop where my mother used to let me sit down and slide. When I dream of my mother, I am in such joy to have found her again that I awake, or else am pained in finding that she cannot understand the English I now speak. I can well recollect her cries when we left her, and I can see now the place where she sat when we parted, and her tearing her long hair. What worlds I would give to possess one lock of that beautiful and much-loved hair. How dreadful to think that so many, many years have passed when it would have done my heart such good to think that you loved me. And when I long to write to you and tell you these feelings I was never able to express. A letter which I'm sure would have been detained by my uncle. And now, how wonderful it is, after 35 years, that I'm able for the first time to hear that you think of me and love me. and I perhaps wondered why I did not write to you, and that you have thought me cold and insensible to such near, dear ties. I thank God that He has opened a way for making the feelings of my heart known to you. Will this reach you? And will you care for the letter of your grandchild? My own heart tells me that you will. May God bless you, my own dear grandmother. And so this letter is sent off, and the grandmother replies and sends her a lock of her mother's hair that she has kept all these years for her. And they make plans to meet, but then the grandmother dies and it never happens. But in that letter, I think you have suddenly illuminated a whole world of emotions which simply aren't expressed, which were clearly once very common and which have been totally forgotten. And my aim in writing this book was to do what I could to shed light on this whole world, which, as far as I was aware, no one else was aware of. Thanks.
Thanks so much, William. What a story. But before we return to Kirkpatrick and Care, about which I'm sure everyone wants to know more, can we talk a little bit about the white Mughals in the plural? Like you mentioned, there were this whole range of Englishmen in different ways, interested in India, in love with India, Indianized. But what struck me from this book and from the little I've read about these white Mughals elsewhere is that they were very, very different people. You had, for instance, an early Governor General, Warren Hastings, who was very sympathetic to India. You have William Fraser, who you mentioned, a resident of Delhi. You have James Kirkpatrick. So you have people who have more of a personal connection. You have the Orientalists like William Jones, completely fascinated by Indian scriptures, Indian religion, but himself not converted. He was still a practicing Christian, however much he was fascinated by Indian culture and religion. And then you talk about a fascinating character called Hindu Stuart, who would issue these pamphlets saying things like English women should wear saris, it's much more becoming, and who completely followed all Hindu customs to the letter, would never eat beef. So what I'm fascinated by is they were actually very different white Mughals, and they were not all Mughals either. So would you like to comment on that, the range of...
Sure.
Yeah.
I mean, the sources, as ever with history, are weighted very heavily to the elite. We know huge amounts about Kirkpatrick. We know quite a lot about William Palmer, William Gardner, William Fraser. The people we know nothing about are the squaddies, the guys, the press-ganged Irishmen, the impoverished Scots, who are sitting in barracks in various provincial parts of India. They, too, have, about 1 in 3 of them, have a long-term Indian Bibi with whom they have children. And that world is almost invisible. We have a few inscriptions, some gravestones, some pictures, the odd letter. But as you work higher up the scale, you get more and more information. And Kirkpatrick is, in a sense, the peak of all. Because that every detail we know about almost, which has resulted in a book of this slightly overweight size. But yes, they're very different men, and some of them have very different attitudes. I mean, there are plenty of Englishmen out there, let's be quite clear about this, who are using their position to have sex with women who are unable to, or for various reasons, are choosing to make a decision for reasons quite other than love. Money, position, status, or simply force. You find letters, even at the peak of this period, which are written in exactly the sort of racist language that will become much more common in the 19th century. There's many references to black women. I had 5 blacks last week, this sort of thing in diaries from Calcutta. But the other side is there too. Kirkpatrick risks his whole career over and over again for his love for this woman. There's several moments when his brother, his boss, the Governor General, is telling him, you know, either you get rid of her or you resign. And he always chooses to stay with her. So it is like any group of human relationships. No doubt the marriages in this hall and the relationships among you here today, there will be every sort of different nuance among a group of 100 people here. So it is true in history. And you can't group them together. I mean, Warren Hastings is a completely different character to William Fraser. Warren Hastings, as far as I know, never wore Indian dress, but did, you know, stimulate the growth of the Royal Asiatic Society, commissioned the first translator of the Gita, and so on. So there's many different things going on. But what unites them, in a sense, is that it's the opposite of the Kipling stereotype. East and West do meet at this period, and often very intimately, and often very successfully.
I thought particularly fascinating was the relationship between James Kirkpatrick and his half-brother William. Both very indigenized men, both very intelligent, well-versed in Indian languages, interested in Indian culture. But here is the older brother who actually, and also William also had an Indian baby. He had children from his Indian partner. So very similar on the surface in their choices and in their careers, both men holding positions of power in the company. But emotionally completely different, because William Kirkpatrick, as you point out, actually had very little feeling for India. Whereas James, like you're saying, was ready to sacrifice his official position because of his love for care. Would you like to talk about that?
So, yes, there's three very highly sexed Kirkpatrick men in this story. There's the old father, who's called the Handsome Colonel. And the Handsome Colonel fathers children across the British Empire. He has a mistress in the plantations of Georgia in the southern United States before the Revolution. He has relationships with Indian women in India and a whole variety of white women. And one of the products of these relationships is William, who is illegitimate and is not acknowledged. And James grows up with a brother who he doesn't much like, called George, and has no knowledge of his half-brother William's existence until he goes out to India. And the father, slightly sheepishly, writes a letter just before he's posted to Hyderabad saying, "In Hyderabad you will find a gentleman with the same name as yourself, Kirkpatrick. He is your half-brother." And Kirkpatrick has been, William Kirkpatrick has worked his way up with no patronage through his own brilliance, and is a slightly scarred character. He hasn't been acknowledged by his father. He's been quietly sent money. His mother is from the lower classes. And it's only his hard work and brilliance. There's a possibility that he's also bisexual. He writes very loving letters to his first friend in the company, Kenway. And he's a much more crabbed character. While James is one of those sort of golden boys who has everything easy. He's good looking, he's charming, his father has lots of money, he comes out, immediately makes friends, speaks from his childhood fluent Tamil and presumably Telugu. His life seems effortless. He falls into the deputy residency of Hyderabad at the age of only 25, which is a very senior position, thanks to William's patronage. And then he nearly screws the whole thing up. And William, who disapproves of his relationship at every level, he thinks, you can go and do what you like privately, but don't let it endanger the company or your career. Is constantly writing to James to say what's actually going on. And of course, for historians, these letters are very, very useful because he's asking him to fess up to the actual reality of his cohabitation and so on. So we get detailed, explicit accounts of the seduction, the meeting. How did you meet her? He said, how on earth did you get this girl pregnant? So we get the details in a way we simply wouldn't elsewhere.
Were there other men like James Kirkpatrick? Because he's unique in the sense that he is questioning the Governor General's wisdom in bullying the Nizam of Hyderabad, and he feels there's another way to do this. So he's not saying, no, the company should not be greedy and should not try and appropriate the Nizam's territories. But what he's saying is, let's do it in a gentler way. Let's negotiate. Let's be sensitive to local mores. So he's a very curious character because he's not questioning the larger ambition of the company here, but he is saying, let's adopt a different approach. At the same time, in a personal sense, he's willing to give up his position because of care. Were there other white Mughals who locked horns with the company officials and who realized, because they know India better and they're in these courts that are away from the presidency towns, who realized that the way the company is treating Indian rulers is actually not the right way to go? Or does he remain unique?
There is a change of company policy with the arrival of Marquis Wellesley. Wellesley is the great forgotten character. We all know about Warren Hastings and Clive. They're both in every textbook. I think Wellesley is much more important than either Clive or Warren Hastings. He's the man who moves the company from being basically a coastal force that has the strip of land between Calcutta and Chennai and another little strip of land around Bombay. He conquers the Indian interior. He fights the war against Tipu, then he fights the war against the Marathas. And by the time Wellesley leaves, the company's got as far as Delhi. He's the elder brother of the Duke of Wellington. And today everyone, again, knows who the Duke of Wellington is, but no one knows who Richard Wellesley is. Wellesley arrives in Calcutta determined to use the company to further the interests of the British Empire. It's the very end of this period when you have this strange anomaly whereby the British Empire in South Asia is being built up not by the government, but by a public limited company. The East India Company is run from a small office in Leadenhall Street, 100 yards of street frontage, as late as the 1760s with a permanent staff of only 30, although it already controls great chunks of South Asia. And Wellesley, according to a new government act, is appointed not by the company, but is appointed by the government. It's called the Maintenance Act, the Restriction Act. Anyway, whatever it's called, it's the government putting its hand on the company. And Wellesley has only deep aristocratic disdain for what he calls the cheesemongers of Leadenhall Street. They are in trade. He thinks that his great passion, he has this deeply complicated relationship with France. He has a French wife, but his whole professional career is dedicated to destroying French influence in South Asia. And his first act is to get rid of the French in Hyderabad, then Tipu, who has a whole French alliance, and then the Marathas, who have French mercenary officers. There is a whole class of young men who are promoted by Wellesley, who are not traders, who are imperialists, and who believe for the first time in the project of an aggressive British conquest of land for the sake of the empire, for political reasons. And they tend to be much more racist. They have ideas of British superiority, Western superiority. They're disdainful of the old ways. And so this whole class, men like Charles Metcalfe, John Malcolm, come in and they rub up against these old boys like Kirkpatrick and William Palmer, who have Indian wives, who wear kurta pajamas, who burp at meals, who live in mahals. And these arrogant young men are promoted over these others by Wellesley. So yes, you have a whole class who are put out to grass. And the most well-documented case is William Palmer, who's a friend of Kirkpatrick and whose Indian Lucknowi wife, Faiz Baksh, is Karunisa's best friend. So these two Indianized residents, one in the residency at the Maratha headquarters of Pune, the other at the Deccani Mughal headquarters of Hyderabad, form an alliance and try to hold and they kind of win because Wellesley is sacked in the end by the government and the company for over-extravagance. He builds this enormous palace for himself in Calcutta, which totally bankrupts the company, with a 15-mile avenue between a second house in Barrackpore. And he gets sacked. And then they send Cornwallis, who is in a sense the old school, back again. So it could have gone either way. And so there is a basic cultural war between the new imperialists and the old white Mughals. But the old white Mughals lose.
Since you mentioned Faiz Begum, the wife of the British resident in Pune, let's talk a little bit about the women. One of the, like you said, the richest source for this book is the letters between James Kirkpatrick and his half-brother, which really delineates in great detail the whole story. We have less sources for Khairun-Nisa because her letters were lost, so we can't really hear her voice, and William tries to reconstruct what kind of person could she have been. She's obviously a very spirited young girl because she chooses to marry James, but what else? What drove her? What were her interests like? What was her inner life? And I wondered, because you are talking about a class of women who were educated, who made decisions. You say that the Zenana was very powerful, and that's often underrated, how powerful women were and how they pulled strings behind the scenes. Did you ever come across any account written by the women about these liaisons, these relationships, these marriages? Is it possible to read this history ever at all from a woman's point of view?
I'm quite sure that if one was... I spent 5 years researching this book and was after the White Mughals and initially came up with nothing. I'm sure if one went at the archive with the same... gave 5 years over to look for the accounts of women, you would find them. There are, I mean, the most obvious, most detailed account by a Bibi, I suppose, is the Begum Sumru. And the Begum Sumru commissioned a whole range of stuff about her. She commissioned a poem about herself. She commissioned a history. There's another Hyderabadi courtesan called Malaka Bai Chanda who commissioned a poem about herself. We have quite a lot about Fies from William and James's own letters. William and William's letters. Sorry, no. James Kirkpatrick and William Palmer's letters. And there's a lot of sort of P.S. Fies says, please tell Care, go get some muslin for me from the bazaar, or she wants some pearls, or that nice palm that she had last time. So we know the sort of things, gifts they're sending to each other and messages passed on by the men. But if you were to go and look for the women, yes, I mean, there's some very powerful women around at this period. This is the period of Ahilyabai Holkar, leading Maratha noblewoman, building temples all over India. This is the period of the Begum Sumru. Women are able to access power at this period.
Let's talk a little about representation and self-representation. And you say very interestingly that there were these accounts of the white Mughals and Englishmen being indigenized. And the Victorians, when they came later in the 19th century, actually doctored many of these accounts. And you actually have instances where biographies and letters that refer to Indian wives were edited so that the references to the Indian women were edited out, which I found amazing that sort of thing actually happened. I'm also very interested in the painting. And like you say, the Fraser album was the last great instance of Mughal painting. I wondered if one reason why the overriding image in our minds of the colonizer in India is the Bollywood version. Could that be because by the time photography took root in the mid-19th century is when British power was being consolidated in India, and the British used photography very cleverly to document themselves and to document the natives. And that sort of took over as an image-making power. Whereas if we had had photography in the 18th century, we would have actually been able to see what James Kirkpatrick looked like dressed in a Nawabi costume. And we don't have that. We don't have those images.
But we have the miniatures. So we do have pictures of Kirkpatrick in Nawabi costume. We have Ochterlony in Nawabi costume. We have this very charming Zoffany of the Palmer family, where Palmer is sitting looking lovingly at Fies. And it's a very intimate family picture. And Fies' sister is there at the end. And I mean, quite a lot has turned up since I wrote the book. There's more, I mean, lots of pictures of bearded men smoking hookahs with lovely ladies at their sides. I mean, we can put faces to quite a lot of them and reconstruct their histories.
Something about the power of photography, I think, and also about the ubiquity of the photographic image that I think took over. Because how widely disseminated were these paintings? Aren't they still very...
Well, they're very private, and before this book, I mean, of the pictures in this book, I think only one of them had ever been reproduced, which is the Palmer family. But I mean, what's so lovely about working in Indian history in general, but particularly working in Indian history in any period outside the freedom struggle or the Great Mughals or the Golden Age of the Guptas, is that there's these huge expanses of history that are unwritten. Particularly this period I've ended up specializing in, the interregnum between the Mughals and the company. There's so much that's just not known. And you can go into an archive and come out with a whole new history because so little work has been done. I mean, that's not true of partition. It's not true of the freedom struggle. Someone like Ram Guha going at Gandhi has, a whole library of other Gandhi books before him. But I've had the opposite problem. I start with the White Mughals with a few old Victorian biographies of Clive and Warren Hastings, and that's about it.
I'm going to ask you one last question, then we open it out. One of the fascinating things for me was there's so much about the white Mughals and about Englishmen in India, but also alongside and inevitably there's so much of the Nizami culture. And that again, I don't think there's that much written about in that detail. And I wanted to know if this culture that you're describing, where the Nizam had a ministry for the promotion of poetry and sensuous pleasures, which from our point of view in the 21st century sounds very decadent. Are you capturing something that was typical of that moment, or are we looking at a very long tradition of the pursuit of the decadent, the pursuit of the sensual? Because that's also part of the narrative of colonialism, that all these local Nawabs and Rajas were just so decadent and they were making a hash of ruling their kingdoms. So, of course, the company and the British had to take over.
No, there's a very specific history to this pleasure seeking. And it has its parallel in English history, I suppose, in the battle between Cromwell and Charles II. You have in that period an oscillation between the Stuarts, who have dogs, mistresses, Charles II famously sleeping with almost every courtesan within sort of 20 miles of London. And then Oliver Cromwell, who's in black, who back closes the theatres. And you have this happening in India, obviously, with Aurangzeb. And Aurangzeb shuts down the theatre, shuts off the music, turns down the noise, closes the atelier of the miniature painters. And the founder of the Hyderabad state, Nizam-ul-Mulk, the first Nizam, is a general of Aurangzeb. And he leaves Delhi in disgust during the reign of Muhammad Shah Rangila. Muhammad Shah Rangila being this sort of Charles II character, celebrating Hindu festivals, dressing in a woman's peshwars, sort of cross-dressing, following pleasure at every side, but also being an incredibly important cultural figure. He's the man who brings the sitar from a folk instrument into court instrument. He brings the tabla from Punjabi folk instrument into a high Hindustani court music. So he's a crucial figure in Indian music and painting. But anyway, Nizam-ul-Mulk goes off and he continues in the Deccan the old Puritanism of Aurangzeb. And he has an office, like the Iranian Guard, of morality. So you have morality police that break up parties and sort of monitor dancing girls and try to drive them out of business. And when he dies, his son Nizam Ali Khan is like Charles II. The miniature painting begins again. The office of morality is turned into the office of pleasure. And so you have this wonderful moment when suddenly it goes from black and white to color. I think the history of sexual relations, like the history of fashion, like the history of pleasure, has its own history. And it goes and oscillates in the difference between Britain in the 1960s and the 1980s, the move from the hippies to the yuppies. These are the kind of waves that history follows, and 8 periods of excess are followed by periods of retrenchment in all cultures and in all periods of history, I think.
It's a very encouraging note, I think, on which to end, because then you can look at what's going on right now and hope that in the larger scheme of things it's just a blip on the screen. Thank you so much for listening.